Welcome back to 1600. A growing number of banks have been talking about returning their government bailout money. And today, the attention focused on the venerable investment bank Goldman Sachs. The New York Times reported Goldman is trying to find a way to pay back its $10 billion in TARP money as soon as next month. Goldman's urgency, according to the Times, was prompted by the uproar over the AIG bonuses and the fears of a spotlight on Goldman's executive compensation. Furthermore, the bailout to AIG itself was controversial in part because AIG then used the funds to bail out other institutions, including Goldman Sachs. Goldman was the largest recipient of the AIG bailout funds, getting $13 billion. Today, Congresswoman Maxine Waters grilled Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner about Goldman's connections to the key players who decided the government should bail out AIG in the first place.
And Goldman Sachs is where Mr. Paulson really spent some time of his career. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Is your chief of staff from Goldman Sachs?
My chief of staff, who is a...
Just tell me. I don't have much time.
But Congresswoman, my chief of staff did spend some time...
He worked for Goldman Sachs?
Working in the past for Goldman Sachs. That's correct.
Okay. That's all I want to know.
Joining us now from the White House is CNBC's chief Washington correspondent and political writer for the New York Times, John Harwood. And John, here are some of the Goldman key LMs that we heard Congresswoman Waters referring to. Former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and the Treasury official in charge of the $700 billion economic rescue, Neil Kashkari. The argument that they endorsed the AIG bailout because they knew the money would flow back into Goldman Sachs. Is that fair?
I don't buy it. I think it was clear that we had a financial system on the verge of meltdown last fall. Ben Bernanke made that point very forcefully with members of the Bush administration and with lawmakers. Ben Bernanke wasn't doing this at the behest of Goldman Sachs. Yes, it's true that Goldman Sachs, as a major player on Wall Street, has produced a lot of the people who've then gone into government, no question about it. Bob Rubin is another example from the Clinton administration, but I don't think that was the motivation for the efforts that the government made.
How big a credibility problem, though, does it pose for administration figures when there are these Goldman Sachs connections and there's the public trying to figure out, okay, why did Goldman Sachs get help from AIG? Why did AIG get help from the federal government? They put this together and they think, oh, these are simply people protecting their friends and former business colleagues.
You know, it's like so much of this bailout, David. The issue of public appearances is sometimes much more difficult to explain than people in Washington believe is really exists behind the scenes. So you saw this backlash over the AIG bonuses. Washington thought it had managed that problem. It became a much bigger problem once it got, in effect, beyond the Beltway. And I think that's one reason why you see Lloyd Blankfein and Goldman scrambling to give back that money to try to fight that perception battle and not make the American people begin to vilify Goldman Sachs the way some people at AIG feel like they've been vilified.
Now, could there be some unintended consequences as far as when banks rush to return the TARP money perhaps sooner than expected? Is there a danger there that perhaps essentially the credit does not get unfrozen because the banks hoard their money and there's essentially a problem because they're not getting the help to their balance sheets that maybe they really do need?
Absolutely, and in fact, the government does not want Goldman to return this money. Remember, David, last fall, some of these institutions, J.P. Morgan Chase as an example, were asked very forcefully by the Treasury Secretary to accept this money when they felt that they didn't need it. Why? Because they thought an all-in approach would encourage others who did need the assistance from get into the program without being tarred with the notion that they're weak. Similarly, right now, if Goldman was to give back this money, then questions would arise. Well, what about the other firms that have gotten TARP money? Are they not strong enough to give the money back? And that could accelerate the erosion of confidence, which has been one of the underlying problems all along.
Talk about a catch-22. CNBC's John Harwood, also with the New York Times. And John, thanks as always. We appreciate it.